Welcome to the Dibley Diaries this week. This week we're going to be thinking about wilderness and why Jesus went into the wilderness and what wilderness and isolation means and the level of isolation in places. So I particularly wanted to start today by thinking about how people can get their knickers in a twist about whether a place is a rural place or not. And there can be a little bit of competition about how rural your rural place is, and different people have different kind of ideas about what that might look like or what that might be. So for example, I have a friend who is vicar in a village, but their village has something like 8,000 people all very close together in a small geography, not spread out at all, and I'm like, I don't really feel that is necessarily rural ministry, although people who live there would definitely say, oh no, this is a village, it's not the town, it's a village, and they would kind of suggest that they have a different identity. However, that might not look similar to people who live in more isolated places. So when people live in villages that maybe have 200 houses, 300 houses, 400 houses, maybe even 1,000 houses, that's still kind of, if that's spread out, that could be really quite a rural place to live. They might be a long way from other places. They might find that is quite an isolating place for people, or the church communities might be really small. And then you can move to places where there are villages where there's 50 houses or 10 houses. What is that, a village? And actually it might be rural, but what sort of area is it? Is it isolated? Is it a farming area? Is it an area which relies mainly on tourism? All those sorts of things. But there can be my rural area is worse than your rural area. We're more spread out, we're more deprived, we're more isolated. And actually all these things aren't that helpful, because a lot of rural areas have similar situations going on where there's not so many people, where house prices might be not so affordable, where there's people who are struggling to live in the villages where they grew up and they quite like to, but they might be forced to move to towns. So there's all these things which happen for people in rural areas, and actually my place is more rural than yours arguments are not usually all that helpful, and can be actually quite a challenge. So what I wanted to say today is, you may feel that you live in a village or a more wildernessy place, and other people might feel they live in a more isolated, more wildernessy sort of place, but actually working together to think about the challenges of rural ministry is more important than this my place is more rural than yours competition that can go on. So this week, for Thought for the Week, we're going to think about Jesus going into the wilderness. So the reading set for the first Sunday in Lent is the bit at the beginning of Mark 1, and then from verses 9 onwards, where Jesus is baptized, and then he goes into the wilderness where he prays, and they say that he had this kind of battle with temptation, which is personified in some of the other Gospels. So Jesus goes away from the distractions in order to concentrate on praying. And that is really our tradition when we are doing something in Lent, so that we can focus on praying and speaking to God and listening to what God has to say to us. When you're away from the other distractions, then it is easier to do that. So being away from distractions from our everyday life, it's helpful. And in the wilderness, you only really have to concentrate on having enough to survive, doing what you need to survive. There aren't other distractions or things there. And one of the things, of course, about fasting and praying is that you get back the time from preparing food, from cooking food, from eating food, and doing the washing up. I mean, there are whole other spiritual things about being hungry and what that might affect in your prayer life, but actually We don't have to spend time thinking about food. We're not distracted by that when we're fasting. I mean, there's all sorts of stuff about being humble and all those sorts of things too. But this thought of Jesus going into the wilderness has been something I've been thinking about this week, preparing for this weekend. So what does it mean for Jesus to go into the wilderness? It must have been simple. It must have been a place where he was not distracted by all the things that were going on, and perhaps where he wasn't listening to all the contrary voices around him. So if that is the focus of Lent, is a time when we can concentrate and focus on praying and listening to God, how do we want to do that? And giving up chocolate is not necessarily going to cut that, unless every time you think, oh, I wish I had some chocolate, you actually stop and pray and listen to God instead. There are all sorts of ways that we can take ourselves to a wilderness place without actually physically having to go to a wilderness place, although obviously sometimes being away is still a great thing. But what do you do to take you to a place where you can concentrate and pray and listen to what God is saying? And there's many different things about that. I used to go into school sometimes, and it talked about prayer to the very little children, and I think they really always hoped that I would say, well, to pray you need to sit still with your legs crossed, your hands together and your eyes shut. Now, on one level, that is a really good way to stop yourself being distracted by who's picking their nose next to you, who's juggling you with their elbow, and it also stops one of the main problems in primary school concentration, is it stops you fiddling with the Velcro on your shoes. But that isn't really what prayer is about. Prayer is about spending time and focusing on being with God in whatever way you can be best, and listening to what he would say. Now, sometimes I would talk to the children when my own children were very little, and I would say to them, well, actually, because I don't have a lot of quiet where I'm not distracted, the best place where I listen to God is in the shower. And sometimes God says things to me when I'm in the shower, and one particular occasion he said, actually, I know you've got this problem, but you need to speak to so-and-so's about it. And that person was the granny of one of the children in the class. And so when I said, well, God said in the shower that I needed to speak to your granny about it, and actually I did, this person had a whole set of skill sets I didn't know which were exactly important to the problem that we had, that we needed to solve. So it may be that you need to sit down with one of these YouTube live stream channels on, or where someone else is working, or you need to listen to something, or you do need to go somewhere else, or go for a walk with just a sandwich and a flask of tea, so that you are not distracted by the things that are going on. How you can do that during Lent will be the thing that you need to find out and work out. But listening, concentrating, praying and listening, that's what the wilderness achieves for Jesus. And the reducing our level of distraction and being able to concentrate on praying and listening to God is an important part of Lent for us as Christians. The Dibley moment for the week this week is about a conversation which I had with somebody when I was at university, and this person had grown up in the far north of Scotland, and she used to say, you know that you live a long way away from anywhere when you are 7 hours drive to the nearest Marks and Spencer's. And Marks and Spencer's is a shop where people go and they get kind of normal, ordinary clothing and things like that. But for her, that was always the sign that she lived a long way from anywhere. 7 hours drive to a Marks and Spencer's. And then when she was a little bit older, they opened a Marks and Spencer's in Inverness. And that was a big thing for them. They felt significantly less isolated by that simple act that it only took them 3 hours to drive to Marks and Spencer's now. Well, that's it for the Dibley Diaries for this week. I pray that you and your village, however large or small, and however far it is to your Marks and Spencer's, have a really blessed week.